Picture this, it's 1873, and you're a young woman who wants to study medicine. You apply to every university you can find. They all reject you. The reason? Doctors say that studying will damage your uterus and render you infertile. Your family says education will make you unmarriageable. Society says women's brains cannot handle intellectual work. But you refuse to give up. You and hundreds of other women keep fighting, keep demanding access to education. This is the story of how they won. Before we uncover this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to light. Now, let's dive in together and discover how universities banned women from education, why doctors claimed learning would destroy their bodies, and how ordinary women fought their way into classrooms and changed the world forever. The university ban, how women were told education would destroy them. Cambridge, England, 1873. The ancient university stood as it had for centuries, its stone buildings draped in ivy, its libraries filled with thousands of volumes, its lecture halls echoing with the voices of young men debating philosophy, mathematics, and science. Women were not welcome. They could not enroll. They could not attend lectures. They could not earn degrees. The doors were closed, the gates were locked, and the message was clear. Higher education was for men. Women who sought it were not just unwelcome, they were told they were dangerous to themselves and to society. The ban on women in universities was not a single law passed by one government. It was a widespread cultural and institutional practice, reinforced by medicine, religion, and tradition. Across England and America, the most prestigious universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, did not admit women. Some had explicit rules prohibiting female enrollment, others simply ignored applications from women or rejected them without explanation. The result was the same. Women were locked out of higher education. The justifications for this exclusion were rooted in pseudoscience and deeply held prejudices about women's capabilities. Medical experts of the era claimed that women's bodies were fundamentally unsuited for intellectual work. They argued that the female brain was smaller and less developed than the male brain, and that extended periods of study would overtax it, leading to mental breakdown, hysteria, or permanent damage. But the most pervasive and damaging claim was that education would harm women's reproductive systems. In 1873, a prominent American physician named Dr. Edward Clark published a book titled Sex in Education, which became one of the most influential texts used to justify keeping women out of universities. Clark argued that intellectual exertion diverted blood and energy away from the reproductive organs to the brain. He claimed that young women who studied too hard during puberty would develop underdeveloped or diseased reproductive systems, leading to infertility, chronic illness, and even early death. He used case studies, most of them unverifiable or outright fabricated, to support his claims. The book was widely read and cited by university administrators, doctors, and politicians as evidence that admitting women to universities would be a public health disaster. Clark's arguments were not new. For decades, doctors and academics had been warning that intellectual work was incompatible with femininity. They claimed that women who pursued higher education would become sterile, lose their maternal instincts, and develop masculine characteristics. Some even suggested that educated women would pass on their weakened constitutions to their children, leading to the degeneration of the human race. These were not fringe theories. They were mainstream medical opinions, published in respected journals and taught in medical schools. Religious leaders added their voices to the chorus. They declared that God had created men and women with distinct roles and that attempting to blur those roles was sinful. Women were meant to be mothers and homemakers. Education would distract them from their divine purpose. Ministers warned that universities would corrupt women's morals, exposing them to ideas and social environments that would make them unfit for marriage and motherhood. But beneath all the medical jargon and religious rhetoric was a simpler fear: educated women would challenge male authority. They would demand rights, opportunities, and independence. They would refuse to be confined to domestic life, and that, more than any concern about health or morality, was what truly terrified the men who controlled universities. Despite the barriers, some women refused to accept their exclusion. They found ways to learn, even if it meant doing so in secret or through unofficial channels. They hired private tutors, attended public lectures when allowed, and studied independently. A few progressive institutions began experimenting with women's education, though often in segregated or limited forms. But for women who wanted access to the same education as men who wanted to attend lectures, use libraries, earn degrees, and pursue careers, the fight was long and brutal. It was into this world that a young woman named Eleanor Hartley entered in the autumn of 1873. Eleanor was 21 years old and lived in a small town outside London. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher and had grown up surrounded by books. Her father, unlike many men of his time, believed that women should be educated. He had taught Eleanor to read Latin and Greek, to solve mathematical problems, and to think critically about the world. By the time she was 18, Eleanor had read more than most university graduates. But reading at home was not the same as earning a degree, and Eleanor wanted to be a doctor. Her desire to study medicine was not impulsive. She had watched her mother die from an illness that might have been treatable if the local doctor had been more skilled. She had seen women suffer and die from childbirth complications because male doctors were often uncomfortable or incompetent when treating female patients. Eleanor believed that women needed female doctors, and she was determined to become one. In 1873, there was no medical school in England that would admit women. A few women had managed to study medicine abroad in places like Switzerland or France, but those opportunities were rare and expensive. Eleanor applied to every medical school she could find in England. She wrote careful, articulate letters explaining her qualifications and her passion for medicine. She received rejection after rejection. Some schools did not bother to respond. Others sent brief, dismissive notes. One administrator wrote back saying that admitting a woman to medical school would be a betrayal of the institution's traditions and an insult to its male students. Eleanor was not surprised, but she was angry. She refused to accept that her gender should determine her future. She began researching universities that had shown even the smallest openness to women's education. She learned about a group of women in Edinburgh, Scotland, who had fought their way into medical lectures at the University of Edinburgh. They had faced harassment, violence, and expulsion, but they had not given up. Eleanor decided she would do the same. In the fall of 1873, Eleanor traveled to Cambridge, where she had heard that some progressive members of the faculty were quietly sympathetic to women's education. She did not intend to enroll officially. She knew that was impossible, but she hoped to attend lectures informally, to sit in the back of classrooms and learn what she could. She found lodging in a boarding house and began attending lectures. At first, no one stopped her. She dressed conservatively, arrived early, and sat in the back row. She took notes and left quietly. For a few weeks, it seemed as though she might be able to continue unnoticed. But then, a professor noticed her. He did not object to her presence, but he mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it to the dean, who was furious. Eleanor was summoned to the dean's office. The dean, a stern man in his 60s, informed her that women were not permitted to attend university lectures under any circumstances. He said that her presence was disruptive and inappropriate. He said that if she continued to attend, he would have her removed by force. Eleanor asked why she was not allowed to learn. The dean said it was not a matter of learning, it was a matter of order. Women did not belong in universities. Their presence distracted male students and undermined the seriousness of academic work. Eleanor left the office but did not leave the university. She continued attending lectures. She was removed from classrooms multiple times. She was escorted off campus by university guards. But she kept returning, and she was not alone. Word of her defiance spread, and other women began joining her. Some were local residents. Others had traveled from distant towns, inspired by the idea that they might be able to access education. The university responded with increasing hostility. Guards were posted outside lecture halls to prevent women from entering. Male students, encouraged by faculty, began harassing and mocking the women who tried to attend. Some threw objects. Others shouted insults. Eleanor and the other women endured it all. They stood outside locked doors, taking notes on whatever they could hear through the walls. They borrowed textbooks from sympathetic students and studied on their own. The situation came to a head in the spring of 1874. Eleanor and a group of about 15 women attempted to attend a public lecture on anatomy. The lecture was open to the general public, but when the women arrived, they were told they could not enter. They refused to leave. A crowd gathered. Male students began shouting. University officials called the police. The women were forcibly removed from the premises. Eleanor was arrested and spent a night in jail. The arrest made headlines. Newspapers across England ran stories about the women who had been jailed for trying to learn. Public opinion was divided. Conservative outlets condemned the women as troublemakers who were violating natural law, but progressive voices began questioning whether it was truly necessary to use violence and imprisonment to keep women out of universities. Letters to the editor appeared, written by women who supported Eleanor and by men who believed the university's response was disproportionate. Eleanor's arrest did not end her fight. It galvanized. More women began showing up at Cambridge, demanding access to lectures. Sympathetic faculty members began holding informal classes for women in private homes. A few lecturers started allowing women to audit their courses, though they could not earn credit or degrees. The cracks in the system were beginning to show. In 1875, a group of reformers at Cambridge, led by philosopher Henry Sidgwick, established Newnham Hall, an informal residence where women could live and study. It was not a college in the official sense. Women still could not earn degrees from Cambridge, but it was a place where they could attend lectures, study with tutors, and be part of an intellectual community. Eleanor was among the first women to enroll. She studied medicine informally, learning from textbooks and practicing with whatever resources she could find. But studying informally was not enough. Eleanor wanted to be a licensed doctor. That required a medical degree, and no English university would grant one to a woman. In 1876, Eleanor made the difficult decision to leave England. She traveled to Switzerland, where the University of Zurich was one of the few institutions in Europe that allowed women to study medicine. She spent 4 years there, completing her medical training. In 1880, she earned her medical degree. Eleanor returned to England as a fully qualified doctor, but England did not recognize her Swiss degree. She could not practice medicine legally. She opened a small clinic anyway, treating female patients who had nowhere else to go. She worked without official recognition, risking prosecution because she believed that women deserved access to competent medical care. Eleanor was not alone in her struggle. Across England and America, other women were fighting the same battles. In Edinburgh, Sophia Jex-Blake and 6 other women had been admitted to the University of Edinburgh's medical school in 1869, only to face violent harassment from male students. In one infamous incident, male students blocked the entrance to a lecture hall, threw mud and insults, and released a sheep into the building to mock the women. The women were eventually expelled, but their fight drew national attention and inspired others. In America, Elizabeth Blackwell had become the first woman to earn a medical degree in 1849, but she had done so by attending a small, obscure medical school that admitted her almost by accident. Her success did not open doors for other women. Harvard, Yale, and other prestigious institutions continued to reject female applicants for decades. The fight for women's access to higher education was not won through a single dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding battle fought by hundreds of women over decades. Universities resisted every step of the way. They created separate women's colleges with inferior resources. They allowed women to attend lectures but not earn degrees. They admitted women to some departments but not others. Every concession was grudging and incomplete, but the women persisted. They enrolled in whatever programs would accept them. They studied harder than their male peers, determined to prove that they were just as capable. They published research, opened clinics, and demonstrated through their work that the pseudo-scientific claims about women's intellectual inferiority were false. By the 1890s, the tide was beginning to turn. Women's colleges, like Girton and Newnham at Cambridge, and Radcliffe at Harvard, had been established. They were still segregated and unequal, but they provided women with access to higher education. Some universities began granting degrees to women. Medical schools slowly, reluctantly, began admitting female students. Eleanor Hartley practiced medicine in London for 30 years. She never received official recognition from English medical authorities, but she treated hundreds of patients and trained a generation of younger women who went on to become doctors themselves. She lived to see women admitted to Cambridge and Oxford, though it would not happen in her lifetime. Cambridge did not grant full degrees to women until 1948. The ban on women in universities was not lifted because men suddenly realized their prejudices were wrong. It was lifted because women refused to accept it. They showed up, they demanded to be let in. They endured harassment, arrest, and exile. They proved through their persistence and their accomplishments that the barriers were not based on any real limitation of their abilities, but on fear and a desire to maintain male power. The story of the university ban is a reminder that access to education is not given, it is fought for. Every woman who attends university today does so because women like Eleanor Hartley refused to accept that learning was not for them. They refused to believe that their brains were too weak, that their bodies were too fragile, that their place was only in the home. They insisted on their right to learn, to think, to pursue their passions and ambitions. And they won, not easily, but completely. Eleanor Hartley died in 1912, at the age of 60. She never married, she never had children. She spent her life doing exactly what she had been told was impossible. She became a doctor, and in doing so she helped pave the way for millions of women who came after her. The university ban is gone, but the fight for equal access to education continues around the world. Throughout history, those in power have used pseudoscience and tradition to justify keeping people out, whether it's women, minorities, or the poor. It makes you wonder what barriers to education exist today that future generations will look back on with disbelief. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to education in the modern world? And if you want to discover more stories of people who refuse to accept that learning was not for them, subscribe to the channel. History is full of women like Eleanor Hartley, ordinary people who changed the world simply by insisting on their right to learn. Let's keep uncovering their stories together.